All right. So now that I talked a little bit about the origins of the first Americans and how the indigenous peoples of North America got here, I now want to talk a little bit about some of the culture and some of the artifacts and some of the important things to know about these early indigenous peoples. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is that we actually don't know much about them. There's not a whole heck of a lot of evidence, and when we do have a lot of evidence, it seems it always is about one thing. So we know a lot about like subsistence and how they hunted megafauna, but we really don't know a lot else about these early peoples. Two is that I'm going to focus predominantly on Clovis here. I talked in the last lecture about how there's this debate in archaeological circles whether these Clovis peoples were the first peoples or whether there was people here before Clovis, the pre-Clovis peoples. And I talked about how most archaeologists today are pretty on board with the fact that there were people here prior to Clovis, that people were here from about 15 to 20,000 years ago, and that more and more sites are popping up that show us that, yes, people were here prior to 12,000 years ago. People were here prior to this culture that we call Clovis. The thing is that even though we have more and more sites popping up, they're still relatively few in number. And usually those early sites tend to only have a few artifacts in them. And there's not a lot of published research on them. So I'm not going to talk much about, or really at all, about those pre-Clovis peoples because we don't really know a lot about them. We know they were here, but that's about it. So for this class, since this is not a North American prehistory class, I want to just focus very briefly on these early indigenous peoples. We're not going to get into too much detail or too much depth. Right? The earliest period of occupation of the Americas we call the Paleoindian period. The word Indian coming from the problematically named Indians that Christopher Columbus used to describe the Native Americans because he thought he was from the West Indies. This name Paleoindian has stuck around, even though we don't usually use the word Indian in archaeology anymore to describe the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And Paleo meaning old. So just like Paleolithic meant old Stone Age, Paleoindian means old Indians. And the Paleoindian period is the name for the oldest period of occupation of the Americas. You can think of it as the North American Upper Paleolithic. There are some similarities between them. The Paleoindian period had a lot of megafauna. It was the Ice Age, so it was particularly cold. And a lot of that thing that's going on that we talked about the Upper Paleolithic, a lot of those same climatic and environmental conditions are still going on here. So if it helps you to think about this as the Upper Paleolithic's equivalent in North America, then go for it, because that's essentially what it is. In general, the Paleoindian period encompasses the time that starts with the initial occupation and the initial colonization of the Americas and ends at about the end of the Pleistocene around 10,000 years ago. So in general, what we're seeing is that the Paleoindian period is starting about 10,000, about 15 to 20,000 years ago, depending on what side of the debate you're taking about when people first got here. And then it ends about the time that the world starts warming up. So the Paleoindian period ends at about the time that we start to see the Mesolithic pop up in Europe. And we talked about all of those changes that the Mesolithic saw because the Earth was warming. We're going to see a lot of changes here in the in North America as well. So the Paleoindian period covers only the Ice Age portion of North American prehistory, and then it's going to end once the world starts warming up. If you're an archaeologist and you're excavating sites in North America and you find a site and you're like, hey, do I call this a Paleoindian site or not? There are really three major criteria that we're going to use to define a Paleoindian site. So first is the age. So to be considered a Paleoindian site, you have to be older than 10,000 years, right? So if your site is older than 10,000 years, you're probably looking at a Paleoindian site. The second thing is that most, if not all, Paleoindian sites are associated with Pleistocene megafauna. So usually you're going to find evidence of mammoths or great bison or these other huge animals that are just walking around the landscape during the Ice Age. We saw some of those megafauna in Europe as well. So we saw things like mammoths and mastodons and woolly rhinoceroses and woolly hippos and things like that. Those were all living in Europe at the time. And we have the same thing here. The Ice Age was kind of the big period for huge mammals and other types of animals like that. And then the last thing we look for to decide if we have a Paleoindian site or not is technology that includes fluted projectile points. And so fluting is what you see, and I'll go back to the slide in a minute. Fluting is what you see here, which is this extra flake that's taken out. So you made this beautiful spear point, and it looks great, and then you take out this extra piece here. And you can see it here in these slides as well. Some of these really early points here, you can see that these were all fluted. We're not really sure why people were fluting things. It may have made it just so that it was easier to haft it or attach it to the spear itself to, hold it in, because now it has a groove for that spear to actually fit into. That's possible, but just keep in mind that fluting a point is really hard to do. You just spent a lot of time making this beautiful spear point, and now you're gonna make this extra notch there. And that has a huge chance of breaking your whole thing. I've tried fluting before. I can't do it. I always break it and I always get pissed off because I'm like, I just spent all this time making this stupid spear point and I just broke it trying to flute it. And so it happens. So it's one of those things that we're not sure we understand. But if you are in a place where you can't directly date the site, if you can't actually get absolute dates, if you find a fluted point, you're probably looking at a Paleoindian site. We don't find fluted points in any other period in North American prehistory. So if you have no other way to date the site, if you find a fluted point, you probably have a Paleoindian site. All right. So the earliest accepted Paleoindian culture is called Clovis. Again, as I mentioned a lot, time and time again, there's growing evidence and growing support that there were people here before Clovis. But those pre-Clovis peoples we don't know much about, so we don't actually call them any individual cultures. Clovis is the first time that we start to see an actual cultural group emerge that we can actually define based on shared similarities in their material culture, in their beliefs and their practices and the things that they use. It's similar to how we started defining these cultures in the Upper Paleolithic. So we had the Solutrean and the Magdalenian and the Gravettian and things like that. Same thing going on here, where Clovis is the first time that we have enough evidence in North America where we start to see this all start to emerge. And Clovis appears probably starting around 13 to 14,000 years ago, depending on where you're at in North America. The cool thing about Clovis is that it appears to be present across all of North America south of the ice sheets. So while ice sheets are still covering most of Canada, if we're looking at predominantly what today we know as the United States of America and northern Mexico, we see Clovis pretty much everywhere. It's not like Clovis is just in one part of the country or not. This is a continent-wide phenomenon that's going on here. And as I mentioned in the last slide, they are associated with megafauna, mammoths and mastodons, most importantly. And they also are characterized by these very large fluted lanceolate projectile points. So these things are huge, they're large, they're fluted, and they tend to have this very classic lanceolate shape, which is the shape that you're seeing on the slide right now. One other thing that's really interesting about Clovis is that we don't actually know much about them outside of subsistence. So we know this culture predominantly and primarily from the sites where they killed these big megafauna. So we call any place where animals are being killed or butchered, we call them kill sites. And this is pretty much all the evidence that we have for Clovis. We don't really have many other sites that tell us a lot of other things about their culture. So we don't really know much about their settlement. We don't know much about how they about social organization or egalitarianism or things like that. We don't know much about things like gender or age or cosmology or worldview or religion or anything like that. We pretty much only know about their subsistence systems. And part of this has to do with the amount of evidence available to us. That is, most of the time when we find a Clovis site, it is a kill site. Part of that is just the theoretical orientation of the archaeologists who are actually studying these sites. So a lot of the times, when you're a Paleoindian archaeologist, if you're someone who specializes in this period, you're probably a processual archaeologist. So you're really into science and really thinking about things like subsistence and how much calories are people eating versus how much calories are they spitting out and all of these types of things. Most of the times, post-processualists aren't doing Paleoindian research, and that tends to just be based on the culture of the period, meaning that the practitioners of the people are already processualists. They're not really accepting of post-processualists, so post-processualists are going to go study elsewhere. So between those two things, we really only know that, yeah, Clovis peoples made these really cool spear points. They hunted a lot of these big megafauna, and that they seem to be highly mobile. So Clovis peoples really weren't settling down. They were moving constantly across the landscape in small hunting and gathering bands. So people around 20 to 25 to 30 maybe people living in a group with them. About 12 to 13,000 years ago, the Clovis people seem to have disappeared. And it seems weirdly enough that we find that the Clovis culture disappears suddenly and all at once. So between about 14 and 12,000 years ago, roughly, we see Clovis and we see Clovis sites everywhere. And then suddenly, bam, all of Clovis is gone. And we see that they're being replaced by later Paleoindian groups. And a lot of archaeologists have asked themselves, why? Why do we all of a sudden see that Clovis just disappear? It's gone. It's boom, like nothing else. Well, some archaeologists have proposed that Clovis as a people died out because of the extinction of the megafauna. And when I say that the Clovis people died out, I'm not saying that there was an extinction event in which people died. I'm saying that people had to change their cultural ways and they had to change the ways that they were living in order to adapt to their changing environmental and other conditions. So it's not that the Clovis people died out, it's that the Clovis culture died out because these people start doing things in a different way and they start adopting different cultural behaviors and cultural trends. The reason that people are adopting these new cultural trends is because of the extinction of the North American megafauna. And so there's a theory that Clovis peoples were just really into hunting. And that's why we find so many kill sites, that the Clovis people just love to kill the megafauna. And that eventually they overhunted the megafauna, which led to the megafauna extinction. So what was happening around 12 to 13,000 years ago, like we saw over in Europe, was that the Earth was starting to get really warm and that we were exiting the ice age and starting to enter into this new global warming period. The megafauna are not biologically adapted to living in warm conditions. Think of a mammoth. They're huge. They have lots of fat on them. They also have lots of fur. Those things don't do particularly well in warm climates. So not only do we have the climate warming up, but people are just hunting these things like crazy, and it's going to cause the megafauna extinction. Once the megafauna go extinct, the Clovis people are like, oh, fuck. Like our whole culture is revolving around hunting and eating and using the materials from these megafauna. So what do? They have to change their cultural ways to adapt to the fact that there are no megafauna left. So this is the current dominant theory about what happened to Clovis. Well, people decided they have to change their ways, start doing things differently because the megafauna are all gone. Right? Once the Clovis peoples go away and once the Clovis culture starts to break down and it disappears, we start to see that there starts to be a differentiation of North American cultures. So I mentioned that Clovis in North America extended pretty much across the entire continent. But what we're starting to see now is that each little area and each little region starts to pop up and get its own traditions. So along the California coast, along the western coast of what we call California today, we see that people start to adopt a lot of maritime adaptations. So if the megafauna are gone, these people are like, well, we live on the coast, we have a lot of fish and shellfish and things like that available to us. So we're going to start to focus on that. So we call this the Paleocoastal tradition. It's a tradition that lasts from about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in which people are like, if we can't hunt mammoths anymore, might as well use fish and shit. So that's what they start doing. In the Western North America, we have Clovis replaced by what we call the Western Fluvial Lakes tradition. And these people are also going to say, if we don't have megafauna, we should be focusing on marine resources. Now, in Western North America, I'm talking more like anything from like the Mississippi kind of plains region to about California, where they're not on the coast, but they do have a lot of access to lakes and other kinds of water, bodies of water that are smaller. They don't have access to the ocean. They have access to large lakes that are giving them things like fish and shellfish and small game. And the reason they were doing this is because at the end of the Paleoindian period here, about 9 to 11,000 years ago, Western North America was still pretty wet. There are a lot of lakes, there are a lot of mountain glaciers, etc. It's not until about 9,000 years ago that North America in the West starts to become a desert and dry out. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about some of those people and how they're going to adapt to that. But we've got another adaptation here. Megafauna are gone, people are going to start focusing on the lakes and on these bodies of water. In the plains, so what we now know to say is like the Dakotas, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc., we're going to get what's probably the most famous of the post-Clovis Paleoindian cultures, and that's called the Folsom Complex. And Folsom is the only Paleoindian culture that retains that fluted projectile point. So I talked about fluting earlier, that extra little notch that you put in, that extra little flick, and Folsom is going to continue to do that. And the reason for this is that, and the likely reason for this is that while the Folsom peoples no longer had megafauna to hunt, they did still have a large mammal to hunt, and those were the bison that really proliferated and spread out across the plains during the global warming period here. And so while they didn't have megafauna, they had something very close, and so they were able to retain a lot of that cultural tradition and a lot of those artifact types that are very similar to Clovis. Okay. Because of this, Folsom, like Clovis, is still predominantly known from kill sites. We don't know much about Folsom outside of, okay, well, we know that they were hunting bison and they were hunting a lot of them, right? So this is what's going on in the plains. And then here in the eastern part of North America, we see that most times people really aren't living in parts of the Northeast because the Northeast would have been covered by lots of glaciers, and even parts that aren't glaciers were really cold. The few people that were living up here were probably focused on hunting caribou, and that became the big part of their subsistence pattern. While people in the Southeast subsisted on a much more generalized forest environment. So in the Southeast, it was warm, global warming is occurring. So at the end of the Paleoindian people in the Southeast are living high on life. They have lots of deer, they have lots of foresty resources, they've got lots of different things to subsist on, and they're just going to be loving life in the Southeast. It's kind of like people today, all the old people want to move to Florida because it's warm there. Same thing, people are moving into the Southeast and it's warm there as well. Right. So once the climate really starts warming up and this global warming really kicks into high gear about 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, we exit the Paleo-Indian period. And we're going to enter into what we call the Archaic period. So the megafauna are gone, the glaciers are pretty much gone. And so people are going to start adopting a much more generalized subsistence economy, very similarly to what we saw in the Mesolithic. And they're going to be adapting to a lot of changes. They're going to be adapting to shifts in the composition and extent of the forests, the loss of these lakes and these bodies of water, in the West. They're going to adapt to rising sea levels and things like that. And we're going to cover all of that in the next lecture, where we talk a little bit more explicitly about, okay, well, now that the Paleo-Indian period is gone, now that we've entered into North America's equivalent of the Mesolithic, what are people doing? And so we're going to talk about that in the next and final lecture of this module.